All right. Anyway, we were talking about some of the historical inaccuracies, and I mentioned that the 54th was not made up of. It was only made up basically of freedmen who were very literate. Like there's that one guy in the movie. However, the regiment was not made up of like a bunch of former slaves. It was made up of freedmen already living in the North.
So, this is an interesting point because, and this goes against the narrative, but according to the books that I've read, most of the slaves that were freed during the war and chose to go on and fight actually fought for the Confederacy. Which is very, I think he has over 60...
Fought for the Confederacy?
I did not know that. I think over 60,000 of them were in the Confederate Army.
Were they were still slaves?
No. I'm talking about the guy... I'm talking about the guys who got freed when they were slaves. So, like...
Oh. Well, then guys in general...
But it is true that slaves were pressed into service in the Confederate Army, obviously. But also freedmen fought in the Confederate Army.
A lot of times they were like cooks and stuff, right?
They were cooks,
like
but they also fought as soldiers.
Yeah.
But
the slaves were usually cooks, right?
Like,
slaves weren't allowed to fight, were they?
Until late in the war, I don't think. But I was talking to John about this when we were at Frisbee, and one of the ironies of the Civil War is that there were black soldiers on both sides, and the ones who were in the Northern Army were segregated, while the ones in the Confederate Army were integrated, which is it's kind of ironic and weird, but it's true. I don't think lots of slaves went on to fight in the Northern Army, and the reason that is number one, there was racism. Number two, not all slaves were universally mistreated. Now, that's not to say that slaves weren't mistreated, because they were, and there's clear historical records on this, and the Denzel Washington's character's got these his whiplashes all over his back. That's totally real. That's not what I'm saying.
Good effects there, by the way. Those look really authentic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did. It looked extremely authentic, and he was like he didn't even care about the lashing, because and so that happened a lot, and it is true that these people weren't even considered human, but that treatment was not, according to the history, was not universal.
Oh yeah.
Some slaves were taught to read and write. Some were given payment that they later used to buy their freedom. And some were treated literally as family members. Mm-hmm. And so...
Yeah, I think Guys in General shows the one slave, we'll talk about this more when we review that, but that works at the house.
Yes.
She's very close with the family.
And you can think of this, the Blackburn and...
She still wants her freedom.
And the Patriot. It was, the cases like that, I'm not denying that the bad cases happened, because they did a lot. But I think that it would be equally historically inaccurate to deny that the other cases happened, which they did. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you put yourself in that position, even if you were a slave and you were freed, if these people treated you well while you were in the institution, I think it would be very hard to turn a rifle over and shoot them. Burn down their house. Maybe you harbor animosity, but can you really shoot them? And there's a whole can of worms to open there.
We can talk more about this on other Civil War reviews.
Yes, there's a whole can of worms there. But I guess my belief about the Civil War, I guess I should go ahead and just talk about my belief about the Civil War so that you can understand in context, because
mine is very similar.
I have heard it both ways. I have heard traditional teaching from the traditional school system about the Civil War, and I'm a reenactor, so I've heard that side of it too. And the traditional school system is the North's point of view, and it's what everyone's taught. And then the reenactor people, they are a proponent of what's called lost cause theory, which is very pro-South, and I've heard it both ways. And I think personally,
it's funny that they refer to it themselves as the lost cause theory.
They don't. That's a name given to it by the other side, and I think that both sides are mischaracterizations in their oversimplifications.
That would be like a football team being called like the Suckers or something. Like just having their name be like, something obviously terrible.
I have referred to them calling it the lost cause sometimes, but they don't call it like a lost cause theory. Yeah. But anyway, we're running out of battery here. We got 10%. We're okay. So I think that both sides are oversimplifications of a very complex and nuanced war. So traditional teaching will tell you that all slaves were beaten to pulp, and every Southerner owned a slave, and the North realized this injustice and were like, oh, we've got to go down there and fix that injustice, as if it just occurred to them. Mm-hmm. And then lost cause theory will tell you that's I've read books from lost cause theory that will say that the South was more progressive than the North, and that there were more abolitionists that live in the South, and that stuff like that it just could not be true. And the truth, as always, I've discovered, is somewhere in the middle. I won't go into the exact details of my beliefs, but that is the general overview of how I feel about the Civil War, just to put it in context with the rest of what I'm going to say. But you take over for a second. I got to grab a charger.
Okay. So just to move on, this is just a quick point. Obviously, Robert Gould Shaw is the only character in the movie who did really exist. The members of the 54th, played by Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, etc., as well as Cabot, played by Cary Elwes, they are all fictional. They are creations of screenwriter Kevin Charest. But they're good characters, as we said. I mean, I'm not as big of a fan